The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Messia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today, I'm talking with Lindsey Banks, who is a staff reporter at the Ledger. Now, if you read the Charlotte Ledger, you're probably familiar with that name because Lindsey writes a lot for us and she produces and sometimes hosts this podcast. So today I'm going to talk with Lindsey about one of her recent initiatives with the Ledger, a pop-up newsletter called Mountain Updates. And we're going to talk about how things are going in the North Carolina mountains now that a lot of the immediate crisis has receded and the area looks to rebuild. Lindsey is uniquely qualified to talk about this because she is a native of the Buncombe County town of Swannanoa, which is east of Asheville near Black Mountain. She grew up there, has friends there, has family there. Some of them lately have been coming down to her apartment in Charlotte to do laundry and to take showers. So Lindsey, I'm looking forward to our talk.
Me as well. Thanks for having me on here on this side of the virtual podcast table.
That's exactly right. Okay, so you grew up outside of Asheville. You went to college in Chapel Hill. Then you moved to Charlotte a couple of years ago to take a great and thrilling job. So you have a little bit of a perspective. Looking back, what was it like growing up in the mountains, and how is that area different from the rest of North Carolina?
Yeah, I think I didn't really realize how special the mountains of North Carolina are until I moved away. Just growing up in the area, you look out the window and you see the mountains, and it becomes kind of normal. And I would say that I didn't really appreciate it until I did move away. So whenever I have the opportunity to go back to the mountains to visit family, the full beauty of that region really does hit me every time I'm driving down I-40 and I come up over that final stretch where you see the first mountain. And so growing up there, I think, was really special in the sense too that the mountain town, of Swannanoa and also Black Mountain is where I went to school. That community feeling where everyone seems to know each other and families, go back generations of, staying in that area, growing up there. And so it really is a close-knit or a tight-knit community. And it was really special to grow up there. And so seeing this past, month and a half, 2 months of what the area has gone through has been really difficult.
Yeah, it is sort of amazing. Just a couple hours to the west of Charlotte, you're in, it's almost like I don't want to say it's a completely different place, but obviously Charlotte is a lot different than than these mountain towns. It tends to be, I think if you look at the statistics, it's a much more rural area, smaller community. It's sort of people, living in smaller communities, with other folks. Asheville's the big metropolis up there. Obviously still much smaller than Charlotte. I mean, Asheville's really grown a lot, in the last few years. But every place is a little bit different. I mean, I think there's some things that are a little bit in common. Charlotte has a lot of connections to the mountains. A lot of people are familiar with going up there, for day trips or, overnight, or they send their kids to camp there, or they have family there, like you do. So, it strikes me that, it is a lot different, obviously, than Charlotte. I'd like to talk a little bit about the storm, the hurricane that came through. And, we've all lived through storms before, maybe not one quite like this, but what was it like, heading into that storm? I mean, I'm imagining if we knew it was coming to Charlotte, we knew that it was sort of headed towards Charlotte. You do things like you're cleaning out your gutters. Maybe you're making sure that you have emergency provisions, you're charging up your phone, those sorts of things. As you were talking to your family and friends as Hurricane Helene was headed that direction, did you sense that they were preparing for it, that they knew that it was going to be bad? What was that whole, episode like leading up to the storm coming in?
Yeah, I think people prepared a little bit. Like my family filled their bathtub up with water. I think also many people, including my family, went to the grocery store and stocked up on, food. And my parents going into the storm had 2 refrigerators full of food, and they weren't thinking about the fact that if we lose power, this stuff is going to be useless to us. And so no one really expected it to be as bad as it was and for the effects to be lingering as long as they have been. I mean, we're at the beginning of November right now recording this podcast, and, clean water, drinking water coming from taps isn't a thing right now in the Buncombe County area. And, it's been 6 weeks almost since all of this happened. And so I just don't think people were prepared for the level of destruction and for how long it was going to be around. And so going into that, that first day, I think full day of rain, which I believe was on a Friday, September 27th, if I'm remembering correctly. I, remember I was fortunate enough too, where my family seemed to be in the spot where they had cell service. It was spotty for sure, but I was still able to get calls and texts out for the most part during this whole thing. But it wasn't that way for a lot of people. And I had friends who were texting me that have parents that live in the same neighborhood as my parents and were asking if my parents could go check on their parents. So I feel fortunate in the fact that I never lost contact with my family, because a lot of people can't say the same.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the big things, I think, initially, was that nobody really understood for a few days sort of how bad it was, because the cell service, a lot of it was knocked out. And so, I mean, what was it like for you that weekend? You're right, the storm hit, I think it came in Thursday night, Friday morning, during the day Friday. What was it like for you that weekend? And just full disclosure, I know you and I talked a lot or texted a lot, at least that weekend, because you were working on an article for that Monday about sort of what was going on. So as best you could tell. And at the time, it was a little bit unclear. But I mean, what was it like for you that weekend, communicating with, your family and your friends up in Swannanoa, Black Mountain?
Right. Well, I will say too, before I go into this, whatever I was feeling, I know it was 1,000 times worse for the people that were actually in Western North Carolina going through all of this. But on the outside, I remember that first day, I spent most of the day trying to figure out a way to get my family out of Western North Carolina, trying to find a route, an open road, which those first few days, there really wasn't. The main roads, the main interstate, I-40, was closed for a couple of days after Helene first hit. And so there was kind of that feeling for me of trying to do what I could to help my family. And eventually a road opened and they were able to find a route out to come to Charlotte. But it's also, I think, important to note too, that not only did the rest of the country not really know the full extent of what had happened in Western North Carolina, people in Western North Carolina didn't know the full extent either of what was just down the road from them. I mean, my family had no idea the level of absolute devastation in their own town until they got to Charlotte and they had cell service and they were able to see some of the photos that were finally loading on social media, that they then realized how bad it actually was. So,
yeah, describe that moment for me, because I remember you talking about this where I think you were in your apartment and you were going through the photos with them. I mean, what was that like? I mean, they're seeing things that maybe weren't all that far from them up there. What was that experience like, and what was their reaction?
Right. Yeah. I think when they were still in Western North Carolina, in Swannanoa, I, had a couple of phone calls with them, and I was trying to describe what I was seeing on the outside. But it's cliche, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But a picture really does show the full extent and kind of puts it into perspective, especially for those who know what it's supposed to look like. I think that's another thing. People were seeing all these photos coming out of Western North Carolina, but had no idea what it used to look like. And so it's kind of hard to place it in that context. And so when my family finally got here, I just started pulling up photos that I had saved and had wanted to show them, but couldn't get out, in a text, going on TikTok, just one video after the other of just, everything coming out of Western North Carolina that my family hadn't got to see. So we just kind of sat here for an hour or two and kind of, we're all on our phones. And whenever we would see something that's like, oh, this is River Road in Asheville, this is the road we would take to get to the Asheville Mall. And we would pass the phone around my living room. And it was just really emotional to kind of see my family for the first time kind of process what had happened. And then that extra level of, them not knowing this was happening just down the road from them was just really heartbreaking. And it was, I mean, we all were super emotional and we're all crying, and still to this day, we'll see an image or hear a story and it brings back all of those emotions.
Yeah. I mean, that's sometimes hard to capture. I mean, we see these photos of just the destruction. You see houses floating down a river. You see, I mean, mudslides, but it's, I would imagine, growing up there, knowing people there, and for your family, being so close to that and just being a part of that community and knowing, like you're saying, what it should be like and what it's normally like. And then just to see it, just so much devastation and destruction must be really, unfortunately, it sounds like your family was all right. I'm guessing you knew some people that, I remember, you wrote about some of them, some of the folks and some of their experiences, some of your old, I think, high school classmates whose houses were washed away, or, I mean, it's just it's hard to put it all into words. It's hard to capture it all, really, even with video, which, does a pretty good job, but it's just pretty daunting, the level of destruction and how that must feel for people in that community.
Right. And it's also hard to think about the time frame of everything and how obviously it's not going to correct itself overnight. And we're looking at months, if not years, until the area is, I wouldn't even say back to normal, because I don't think it's ever going to be the same. All these businesses that have been around forever, you hope that they'll be able to come back. But I mean, some like, especially in that, Swannanoa area, and then, Asheville, River Arts District, and Biltmore Village. I mean, those businesses were completely gutted, literally and figuratively. So I don't know if they'll ever come back, at least to what they were. The hope is that maybe one day we'll kind of see it back to somewhat normal, but just knowing that it's going to be a long process of recovery is also really emotionally taxing, especially with the holidays coming up. And, the season that we're in right now, recording this podcast, is fall, and fall, is a huge time for the mountains and for the economy, and, tourism is booming usually this time of year. And so that's also, I think, been a hit on the area as well. So,
yeah, I mean, I do think we're in this, I think this was sort of known, but there, these sorts of things go through stages. There's a lot of attention, national, international attention, right, when all these images are coming out, and then people are, driving up van loads of, canned food and, necessities, for a period of weeks. But now that a lot of it, that immediate part of it is finished, I mean, a lot of that attention and a lot of that glare, kind of comes off, and the community is left with trying to kind of put everything back together like you said, to the extent that you can ever do that. People are resettling, people are left without homes. You got to figure out, there's a lot that people have to figure out. People leave, which, I mean, how do you see the progression of what's going on in the mountains?
Yeah, well, my mother is a first grade assistant teacher at a school in Black Mountain. And when they returned to school I guess it was late October, when they resumed classes, there were 3 students in my mom's class that were not returning. I think one of them was being homeschooled, maybe 1 or 2 of them. And then one of them, the family moved away permanently, which I think is not super surprising and also not uncommon right now. I've heard that a lot of people have, especially people that recently have moved to the area or have not been, in Western North Carolina long, have decided to move back, back to where they're from, or back to where they were living previously, especially those who lost their entire homes, because the area is also expensive to live in, normally, especially the Asheville area. And so just kind of, I think, thinking about, rebuilding or resettling somewhere else in that region is just not financially possible right now for a lot of people. So I've seen a lot of people moving away. And again, a lot of businesses, especially in the Asheville area, are reopened, especially in downtown Asheville, and they've kind of resumed, I guess, somewhat normal operation, even though drinking water is still a little bit iffy. There are ways around that, with boil water advisories and personal filtration systems and things like that. But I think, I don't know, I mean, this obviously isn't normal, but there have been a lot of especially churches, but just groups of people in general who have really come together to try to support those who, maybe lost everything or who are not in a financial situation to be able to rebuild or, afford groceries or, things like that. And so there's been a lot of community hubs that have come together with supplies and, a lot of the donations that have come in from other parts of North Carolina and the country, have come to the region and are being distributed at these supply centers. And so obviously that's not a normal thing to be seeing when you're driving down the road in Western North Carolina, to see grocery stores that are still closed. But then across the street, you're seeing a big, supply distribution center. But it has been really, I guess, hopeful, but encouraging and warming to kind of see the community come together in that way. Like we were talking about earlier, the community, there's a really strong sense of community. So to see that didn't change at all has been good to see.
Yeah, it did seem, I've been up there a couple times and I don't have as close a connection to the mountains as you do, but just driving through some of the towns, and you would see this in a lot of the towns where they would have, sort of makeshift tents, volunteer check-ins, there'd be a small store across the street. And it would typically, when I was there, I went through Saluda, Hendersonville, Brevard. They would have bottled water stacked up high. They would, people would, the morning I went through Saluda, someone had dropped off several dozen donuts for volunteers. I'm not suggesting that in any way makes up for the devastation that they had and they'll be recovering from for a long time. But it's nice to see that some of the immediate needs were being met, and that people, I'm guessing from around the area and from around the region and from around the country, were trying to help out and get the resources there that needed to get there.
Right. And again, that's only in parts of Western North Carolina that are accessible or that were accessible by road. There are a lot of communities and towns that were a little bit off the beaten path that did struggle with getting those supplies in. Again, like Asheville and Swannanoa and Black Mountain, I think got a lot of attention from media, which, as they should, they experienced a lot of devastation. But there were a lot of towns that experienced the same level, if not more, that did struggle and are still struggling to get those much needed supplies and immediate needs met.
No, that's a good point. I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we at the Ledger did. We started up, it was just a few days after the storm hit, we started up a newsletter called Mountain Updates. We put it out every day for more than 2 weeks. We've designed it as a pop-up or temporary newsletter. You've been really spearheading that effort, and I think it's been great. We've gotten a really good response. We had a huge number of signups for it in the first couple of weeks. People really wanted to know what was going on. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the process of putting that together? And again, just so people understand, the idea is, if you're in these communities, there are different ways you find things out, Facebook groups or local media or TV or radio, something like that. But, if you're in Charlotte and you have some connection there, you want to know what's going on, or at least initially, there was a lot of information. So we decided, well, maybe we can kind of comb through some of that and share the best of what's out there so that people can really understand what's going on and provide a little bit of a step back kind of perspective on it. But could you talk a little bit about how you put that together and what that's been like?
Yes. Well, kind of what you were just talking about. I think that is the appeal of the newsletter, is that you can just come to this one place. In those first 2 weeks, it was every day. So every day you could come to this one place and get all of the important updates coming out of the region that you need to know. And so for me, writing that newsletter every day and then now writing it, a couple of times a week, it felt, I guess, a little bit, I don't know if I want to say natural, but I was already consuming, all of these updates coming out of Western North Carolina from local media sources, the ones that I grew up watching and reading. And so I, every day was already reading all this stuff. So I knew kind of what was the important stuff and what people, outside of Western North Carolina needed to know about what was happening, in that region. And so it's been also, I think, especially that first week or two, for me, it's been helpful in processing, what has happened to Western North Carolina. It was really tough, I think, for me and for a lot of people, that have family and friends in that region, just kind of sitting here and not knowing how to help and not really having the finances, as much as I wish I could have gone to a store and bought up a bunch of cases of water bottles and food and, driven it over to Western North Carolina, I couldn't really do that. So this newsletter was kind of a way for me to help the region and kind of process what really happened in Western North Carolina.
Yeah, I hope it's been positive for you and it's not like we're forcing you to relive a traumatic experience over and over again. But we want to make sure that people have the information. And then if they choose to act on that, we do include, hey, here are ways that people can help, whether it's donating or, here are organizations that need volunteers or whatever it is, that we think that's something that's important for people to know. And I hope it's been good for you personally as well.
Yeah, it has been. And also with all of these updates, with the power situation and the water situation and, the death count that's been rising, we've also highlighted some bright spots, which I think has been good. Again, like the community coming together, like, for example, the church that I grew up going to in Black Mountain became this kind of community center, for supplies and distributing the supplies. And so I think one newsletter I wrote about that. And so it's been good too to highlight the good things and the good stories that have come out of the region as well.
So as you've been covering this ongoing story, has there been anything that surprised you?
I don't know if I would say it was surprising for me, but I think maybe it was surprising for folks reading the newsletter, or at least maybe that's some of the feedback I received, that they didn't know how bad it really was I wouldn't say until they read the Mountain Updates newsletter, but I think as time went on and more coverage was coming out of that region and the full devastation really started to be exposed, I think it, was surprising for folks that maybe don't have people that live in the area and weren't getting those firsthand accounts to actually learn and see what's happening in Western North Carolina, and also how long it's going to take to recover, and how, we're at the time of this podcast, it's been almost 6 weeks, and how the water situation has still not been fixed. And we're still a minimum a month away for it to be hopefully back to potable water. And so I think that's been, I guess, I don't know if that's surprising for me personally, just because I did have friends and family kind of giving me those firsthand accounts, but it's been surprising, I think, for others just to see the true extent of the devastation.
So now that it's been more than a month since this storm hit, what's your sense of how people are doing? And people obviously have different circumstances, and you hate to paint with a broad brush, but what's the vibe? What's the outlook? Are people optimistic? Are they, hey, I can't believe this is still going on and I don't have water? Or what is the feeling that you're hearing from people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think right now it's a mix of frustration and hope or optimism, I guess. Just, I think, every day you would hope that there's a little progression as far as repairs go. I know, like, for those first few weeks, there didn't seem to be a lot that was happening, at least like visually. You drive along the road and you're still seeing piles of debris. And I think that still is the case in some areas, obviously, but I do think some of it has started to be cleaned up a little bit, which I think is offering some hope to people that at least, their towns are starting to look normal or somewhat normal again. But then again, kind of like you were saying, that frustration with the water situation, especially, I think is that it's just at this point, they're just kind of over it. They're done. They're ready to have potable water again, especially with Thanksgiving coming up. And in Buncombe County, they're predicting the water situation to be fixed after Thanksgiving. So now people are starting to have to think about what they're going to do for the holidays, which is adding a whole other level of stress and frustration. And there's been also some miscommunication, I think, with the Asheville Water Resources Department and the timeline and the lack of clarity and when things are going to be back up and running. And so that has also been another, I think, frustrating thing that people are going through right now.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good place to end it. Thank you for all your work on Mountain Updates and on this podcast and everything else that you do. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. It's been great.
To our listeners, thank you for listening. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is produced by Lindsey Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.